Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome again in this lovely evening. This is Arab TV and I'm your host, Zaid Faransso. My guest today is Sharat G. a research fellow at the San Jose Peace and Justice Institute. And he's here to talk to us a little bit about a current topic that has been on the news a little bit more than usual these days. He's talking about the crisis and the current situation in the city of Gaza. Welcome, Mr. Len.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to have you here as well. I'd like to start by introducing you, and I want you to do the mission for me. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got involved in the Middle East situation, and most specifically in the Palestinian crisis.
Well, I've got interested my training is actually in the medical field, but I became interested in the Middle East right after the Six-Day War in 1967, because the facts that I could gather did not correlate with the policies, particularly the U.S. policies at that time. And so I wanted to go to the Middle East and see for myself what the realities were. And so I went to study at the American University in Beirut, Lebanon. And I was there and studied there for a while in the medical school, and had a chance to travel around. In fact, that is the first time that I went to Gaza.
Great. So let's back up a little bit. There's a couple of things that interested me in the situation. So you're not really into the field. Well, you were not in the beginning into the field. You were a medical graduate. Did you finish medical school?
I did not. I switched a little bit and got my doctorate in medical physics.
Wow, it really requires a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of interest in something to deter you from finishing medical school. Then I see that you were in the United States when something grabbed your attention, something quite unusual happening on the field, and that took you to the area, and that what stirred the attention at the first instance, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so from there, tell us a little bit about how the situation or how the story built up into what we're having right now. Your situation first, and then we'll pass by the situation in Palestine and in Gaza specifically, and we'll talk in a little bit of depth about the history there.
Sure. Well, so while I was in Lebanon, I traveled to Palestine and then to Israel. And when I was in the area, then I traveled also to Gaza. Of course, it was not Gaza was never, at least at that time, a tourist destination, but I really wanted to see for myself what the situation was. And of course, in those days, Gaza was in a much better shape than it is today. You could freely travel between Israel and Israel proper and Gaza. At that time, after the '67 war, Israel had taken Gaza from Egypt, and so there was no real border between Gaza and Israel proper. And also you could freely travel between the West Bank and Israel proper, because Israel had also taken over the West Bank from Jordan as a result of the '67 war. And while I was there, I met Palestinians living in Gaza, and of course at that time, many of them, there are some who are the original residents of Gaza who had been there for generations. There was a big wave of migration that came in 1948 because of the war by which Israel conquered more land than was allocated by the United Nations partition in November 1947. And in fact, if you look back at the original UN partition, a much larger area was allocated to what is Gaza, and as a result of the '48 war of conquest, Gaza was reduced to the small size that we see today. And but nevertheless, back in 1973, which is the year that I went to Gaza, life was still, there was still some normalcy. and there was still a flow of goods going in and out. Palestinians were still productive in agriculture, small industries. There were even ships that were still coming to Gaza port as late as 1973. And so that changed within a few years and became progressively worse after the Oslo Accords in 1993.
Okay. I'll go to describe what the city looked like in your eyes, a foreign tourist or an interested wanderer, if I may say so. When we hear the names of cities, towns, and countries, we usually have an impression. And then when we go there, we try to fit the impression that we have with the vision that we see in real life. What impression did you have, and what was the real life vision that you saw in there? What kind of city is Gaza? How big? What kind of population? And what industries support that population?
Well, today Gaza is a much larger city than it was at that time. And Gaza today has more than 500,000 people. Although most people don't know it, it actually is the largest Palestinian city, even larger than Ramallah in the West Bank. And the impression I had then was that, well, it was a third world city at that time, actually a town, you could say, because in 1973 there were very few high-rise buildings. And today, if you look at it, you'll see it's just full of high-rise buildings because of the dramatic increase in population. And of course, today it's much worse because many of the aspects of infrastructure are lacking, and then there's been a lot of destruction as a result of wars that Israel has launched on Gaza. And many of these buildings have not been reconstructed because Israel has, since 2006, not allowed the importation of construction materials and the border crossings, the checkpoints between Israel and Gaza have been closed or opened very, very limited for very limited periods of time.
So we're looking at a densely populated center that have grown from just a simple town with a fairly large population at some time in the 70s to one of the biggest cities in the Palestinian territory right at the moment. The growth has been in terms of population size, but never in terms of affluency, in terms of wealth. We can probably mention a few or remember a few years when Gaza used to have a short period of rest, a few evidence, some evidence of development here and there, but nevertheless that didn't make it into the metropolitan center that is supposed to support that kind of population. We have a few slides in here. If we can take a look at one of these slides, starting with the first one. This slide shows the current situation of Gaza. Is that correct?
Yes, because there's very recently, just in the last few days, there's been an emergency situation in Gaza because of the weather, some very adverse weather that is, most likely the result of global warming. But there's been a massive flood that has taken place in Gaza, and an unusual cold spell that has dropped snow in the Holy Land. Now, because Gaza is at sea level, there was no snow in Gaza itself, but it's quite cold for people who are not used to that kind of cold weather. So people are suffering with the cold, and on top of that, because Israel has restricted or almost cut off entirely the flow of diesel fuel entering Gaza, there's no more fuel to power the Gaza power plant. It has only one major power plant, and so people don't have electricity, they don't have fuel to heat their houses, and so they're really suffering in the cold. So the next slide shows a close-up of the flooding. So people are forced to get around using these boats. And well, fortunately, Gaza is traditionally was a fishing town. So there are lots of small boats that can be used for getting around, but obviously it's posing a major obstacle for many of the civilian residents. And in the next slide, you can see that many people have been, because of the flooding, have been forced out of their homes. And so the authorities have been putting them up in whatever public facilities are available. In this case, there's a family that's huddling in a classroom of a school, and you know, just trying to keep warm with a wood fire because they don't have fuel. So that's sort of the current emergency situation in Gaza. And,
so what we're looking at is a situation of a town that lacks some of the most basic needs, some of the basic services that any small town here in the United States never even thinks about. The situation that we see in the previous slides is not the product of the past few months. It can be the result of a heavy spell of rain or some cold weather that is not usual in that area, but the cold weather and the rain didn't really create the mess. What created the mess, what created the chaos over there is years and years of neglect and lack of services. How did the city that was once beautiful, vibrant, deteriorate into this current condition is probably what we're going to venture upon.
So Israel has launched you know, periodic wars. I mean, in any given recent year, Israel launches several invasions into Gaza under the pretext of trying to kill a Hamas militant, and or under the pretext of a response to the Qassam rockets that are sometimes fired from Gaza. But what is ignored in these news reports is that the Qassam rockets are in response to Israeli raids. And so it's a back and forth situation, and the Palestinians, you know, themselves are feeling that they have a right to self-defense, and you know, they need to respond in some way, and they don't have any, you know, real means of responding. They don't have a well-equipped army. They don't have an air force, and well, the whole population is really trapped in this small place. And to give you some idea of how confining the situation is, we can look at the next slide and see that Gaza is just a small territory that is bordering the Mediterranean Sea, and it is surrounded on two sides, the north and the east, by Israel, and on the southwest by Egypt. And to get an idea of the size of Gaza, we can look at the next slide and see that this is a map of the cities of Santa Clara County, or at least the major cities of Santa Clara County. And in the next slide, you can see that this is Israel Gaza in comparison to the cities of Santa Clara County. And what one has to imagine is that, well, these cities of Santa Clara County collectively have about 1.7 million people in them. And if you take those 1.7 million people and then compress them into the area that you see in black, that's Gaza. So Gaza, even though it's a territory, it has farmland, it has open spaces, it has beaches, but it's actually much denser than any of the cities of Silicon Valley, and it has the same population as those cities. So in other words, we're packing 1.7 million people into an area that is much smaller than the cities of Santa Clara County.
I'm going to speak as an outsider and build on what you just said, thinking that Gaza is that isolated unit of land or mass of land. But that raises a question. What is Gaza in relation to the Palestinian territory? and how did that develop? How did this isolation develop? What was the political, military conflict or context that led to the isolation of Gaza?
Well, the first one is the, I mean, if we go back to 1948 or 1947 and the UN partition, the UN partition was at least partly based on existing populations, and Gaza was an area where there was an overwhelming Palestinian population, and so it was partitioned to the future or the hopeful state of Palestine. But much more recently, there was an election, an election in January of 2006, and what you see in the media is that, well, Hamas won the election in Gaza, and so that sort of started the split between Hamas on one hand and Fatah on the other, which came to rule the West Bank. The reality is that Hamas actually won the election in both Gaza and the West Bank. And so even though there was a conflict, an armed conflict in 2007 between Hamas and Fatah, which are two factions, two political parties with armed wings among the Palestinian people, and Hamas came to control Gaza, it did so not so much through the armed conflict, but because it won the election in Gaza. And if any government is legitimate, it is the party that actually got elected, and that is the government that presently exists in Gaza, whether one agrees with it or not. And that has contributed to the isolation of Gaza at the present time, because you have the Fatah government in the West Bank, with which Israel and the United States are negotiating or attempting to negotiate a peace treaty, and the Hamas government in Gaza, which is not represented in those negotiations, and of course it's not represented deliberately. I mean, Israel refuses to deal with Hamas, even though it has a cohesive leadership, even though its leaders are rational, and the United States, on top of that, makes it worse by refusing to negotiate with Hamas. And there really isn't a solution unless Israel and the U.S. deal with all of the Palestinian people and their representatives.
So that's one, or these are at least a few of the points. I also understand that what came to be known as Gaza nowadays have been subject to frequent episodes of shaving, so to speak. The size of that district has been constantly decreasing over the years. Sometimes we know the reasons, and sometimes it happens just silently, and people don't really get that in the news. What's happening over there?
Okay, so what I want to do is show some slides to give you a sort of a sense of what things were like and what things are what has been happening in recent years. There was a time, as you can see in this slide, where life was fairly normal, and you know there was trade. People could enjoy a walk on the beach. In the next slide, we are looking at how the borders and how the control of Gaza has changed over the years. In 1948, when Israel gained independence, Gaza was controlled by Egypt, and so the border was at the north end of Gaza. In the next slide, we see that in 1967, after the 1967 war, Israel seized control of Gaza, and so the one border became a border between Gaza and Egypt. In the next slide, we see that in 1994, this is after the Oslo Accord. Oslo was not a single accord, it was actually a process, and that's why many people call it the Oslo process. And in 1994, the Gaza-Jericho Agreement set forth the sea boundaries of Gaza as a 20 nautical mile limit, along as well as two buffer zones, a buffer zone with Egypt and a buffer zone with Israel. In the next slide, in 2002, as a result of the Bertini Agreement, Israel imposed a 12 nautical mile limit on Gaza fishing. So that means fishermen from Gaza, although fishermen anywhere else in the world are free to go out into the open seas, international waters. Ever since the Oslo Accord, the Gaza fishermen had been limited to going out to 20 nautical miles. And in 2002, they were limited to 12 nautical miles. In the next slide, in 2006, this was before the, there was fighting that took place, and then the Israeli Defense Force reduced the fishing limit to 10 nautical miles. Next slide. In 2006, in October, it reduced it to 6 nautical miles. And then the next slide. It imposed some additional. It increased the buffer zones on the north and the south, which further limited the fishing zone. And then in the next slide, in 2009, with the war that Israel launched, Operation Cast Lead, at the end of December 2008, a 23-day war that killed 1,400 Palestinians in Gaza, and Israel reduced the fishing limit to 3 nautical miles. Now, even then, despite this 3 nautical mile limit, sometimes the Israeli warships enter this zone and fire it at Palestinian fishermen within the 3 nautical mile limit. And in the next slide, we see that this 3 nautical mile limit has been maintained to this very day. And we also see that one of the potential interests of Israel in Gaza's waters, territorial waters, is the fact that there are actually 2 natural gas fields that have been discovered off the Gaza coast. And these 2 fields are currently under active exploration. So Israel does have another interest in these waters. And in the next slide, we can see that now this was during Operation Cast Lead. In January of 2009, Israel used all sorts of weapons, and in this case, this is white phosphorus. And white phosphorus, if it touches a person, it continues to burn. There's nothing you can do to put out the fire, and it burns through the flesh and right to the bone. It's one of the most disfiguring weapons that you can imagine, and Israel used white phosphorus many times during Operation Cast Lead, and in this case, this bombardment was next to a United Nations school, and that vehicle that you can see in the image is an ambulance that was nearly hit by the white phosphorus. And we have another civil war going on in Syria, and when chemical weapons were used in Syria, the world community got together and said no chemical weapons should be used by either side in the Syrian civil war. And so why should Israel be allowed to use chemical weapons? Why doesn't the United States, why doesn't our government take a stand on this? This is an ambulance, a Palestinian ambulance. the Palestinian Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, that was bombed by Israel during Operation Cast Lead. This is not an isolated instance. There have been many instances where Palestinian ambulances were targeted by Israel. And these are some of the ruins of houses that were destroyed in Gaza, and those tents behind. Some of them are the tents where the residents of this house are living and have been living for several years. And next slide. These are the fishing boats that have been idled by Israel's arbitrary limitation of the fishing zone. Next slide. And because of the blockade by Israel and also by Egypt, the Palestinians, the only response that the Palestinians could do was to build tunnels under the border to bring in essential supplies of food, fuel, and so forth. And that final slide shows the that life nevertheless still goes on. The Palestinian people are some of the most resilient in the world in the face of all these difficulties.
Well, eventually we are glad that things go on, but when they go on with all these obstacles, we can be assured that people in that part of the world are definitely not the normal kind of people. They've been surviving, not just living. I'd like to thank you at the end of our conversation for painting an image that a lot of us didn't really know about how this situation evolved. Thank you, Dr. Lin, and we were really delighted to hear your take into the problem.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.